Welcome back everyone. This is episode 7 of season 2 of Blender Story series. Today, we're diving into creating materials for Andy's nightstand. But before we jump in, let's talk about something super important that you'll face again and again when working with materials: texel density. Have you ever noticed how textures get blurry when you zoom in on an object? Or why some objects look sharp while others look pixelated? That's all because of texel density. We briefly touched on this in episode 5, but today, we're going a bit deeper. Don't worry, it's still beginner friendly. I'll show you 3 simple ways to fix these issues, and we'll also explore one of the coolest workflows for creating materials, UDIMs. Don't panic, it's not too advanced, I promise. This episode is super important, so don't skip this lesson. If you need to, watch it twice. Trust me, you won't regret it. These concepts will save you tons of headaches later on. As always, remember you can download the model we're using today for free from the link in the description. And if you haven't joined our Discord community yet, now is the perfect time. It's completely free, and it's a great place to ask questions, share your work, and learn together. Just click the link in the description. It takes less than a minute, I swear. Okay, now if you're set, let's dive in. Today, we'll use the texture-based method to create materials. But this time, we're doing it differently. I want to show you a cool, simpler technique for using texture maps. I promise you'll love it. The wood textures we'll use here are the same ones we used for the bookshelf in episode 4. You can grab them from ambientcg.com. Make sure to download both the wood and metal textures in 2K resolution and PNG format. I've already added the links in the description below. Once you've downloaded the files, extract them and place them in the texture folder of your project file, or just keep them near your Blender project for easy access. Before we start building the materials, let's handle the UV mapping. Now, since we covered most of the basics of UV unwrapping in earlier episodes, I won't go step by step through every detail this time. Instead, I'll focus on the key steps and quickly show you where I place the seams for each object. If you've been following the previous episodes, I'm sure that with the explanation I provide here, you'll be able to UV unwrap this model on your own. This is a great opportunity to challenge yourself and see if you can solve problems without needing the video as a crutch. After all, isn't that what we're all aiming for? To stand on our own 2 feet and tackle challenges independently? You're getting closer and closer to that goal. Of course, it's completely up to you how you want me to present the material. Since this course is made for you, your feedback is super important. It helps shape the structure of future episodes. So, after watching this episode, please leave a comment letting me know what you think about this approach to explaining UV mapping. Would you prefer I go step by step in real time like in earlier episodes, or are you comfortable with this faster, more concise style? Your opinions matter a lot. They help make this course better for everyone. Let me know what works best for you. Alright, let's get started. In the first step, I should have created a temporary UV grid material so I could use it to check the UVs. So, I selected this object, split the viewport into 2 sections, and switched this one to the shader editor. Then I created a new material, added an image texture node, clicked New, and chose the UV grid texture as the generated type. I connected this node to the base color, and in the 3D viewport, I enabled material preview so I could see the material applied to the object. In the second step, I prepared the user interface for the UV unwrapping process. I switched the shader editor to the UV editor, hit Tab to enter edit mode, and activated the sync selection option. This ensured everything was ready to go. In the third step, before starting the actual UV unwrapping, I made sure the scale of all objects was set to 1. So I opened the Object Properties panel, checked their scale values while selecting each object one by one, and noticed that 3 objects needed their scale applied to reset it to 1. To fix this, I held Shift to select all 3 objects, pressed Ctrl A, and chose a scale to apply their scale for them. With that done, Step 3 was complete, and I was fully ready to start UV unwrapping. In Step 4, I focused on marking the seams for each object. My goal was to place the seams in areas where they're least likely to appear in the camera view. For this object, I marked these edges as seams. Next, after selecting all components, I pressed U and chose Angle-Based Unwrap to unwrap the UVs. Next, I assigned the UV grid material to this object, and I started marking the seams. I marked these edges as seams, then unwrapped again using the angle-based method. In Face Select mode, I hovered over this UV island, pressed L to select it, and rotated by 45 degrees. Then it was time for the nightstand drawer. I assigned the UV grid material, marked these edges as seams, and unwrapped it again using the angle-based method. Once more, I made sure Face Select mode was active, hovered over the UV island, pressed L to select it, and rotated by 45 degrees to make it look clean and organized. Finally, I moved onto the nightstand legs. Remember, we used a mirror modifier to create these legs, so I only needed to UV map one of them. After assigning the UV grid material, I marked these edges as seams and unwrapped it. That's it. Now it's time for the objects related to the drawer handle. First, I assigned the UV grid material to this object. Since we used a subdivision surface modifier, the shape of the object had changed significantly. To avoid texture distortion due to this change, I needed to apply the modifier while keeping the final shape intact. Here's what I did. I reduced the subdivision level to 1, moved the cursor over the modifier, and applied it using Ctrl A. Then, I added another subdivision surface modifier with a level of 1 to keep the mesh slightly smooth. As you can see, this ensures the subdivision doesn't alter the original mesh too much, preventing any texture stretching or warping. After that, unwrapping was super simple. I pressed A to select all components and unwrapped it. Wait, what about marking seams? Well, for meshes like this object, where part of the object is open, the edges along the open areas are automatically treated as seams by default. So, there's no need to manually mark them as seams. Finally, I simply rotated the UV line slightly so the texture would align properly on the object. Next, for these spherical objects, I didn't do anything special. First, I assigned the UV grid material, then went into edit mode, selected the UV island, and scaled it down on the y-axis to ensure the texture appears square-shaped. Since we used a mirror modifier for this object, the change applied to both spheres automatically. Next, I moved onto this object. To give it a slightly more cartoonish and stylized look, I decided to tweak its modeling a bit. First, I added a bevel modifier, set the segments to 4, and beveled the edges slightly to soften their sharpness. Next, I switched to edit mode, pressed Ctrl R for loop cut, clicked once, and then right-clicked to place it at the center. With the new edge loop still selected, I pressed S to scale it up slightly. While the edges were still selected, I pressed Ctrl B to add another bevel and scrolled to add one edge toward the center and 2 edges on either side. Finally, I added a subdivision surface modifier set to level 1 to smooth everything out. I was much happier with the new appearance. After that, I marked these edges as seams, assigned the material, and straightened the UV island using the technique I showed you in episode 5 of this season. Next, I rotated the UV islands to ensure the texture appeared straight in those areas. However, I noticed some texture distortion here. After investigating, I realized the issue was caused by lack of sufficient edges in this section. To fix it, I used Ctrl R to add an edge loop close to the edges on both sides of the object. Finally, I tackled this object, the one we created using a curve. Remember? Before doing anything else, I needed to convert it from a curve to a mesh so I could properly access its components. Before converting, I went to the object data properties and adjusted the resolution to 6 to keep the resulting mesh lightweight after conversion. Then, I simply right-clicked and chose Convert to Mesh. After assigning the material, I noticed the texture seemed to be displaying correctly on its own. When I entered edit mode, I confirmed. Yes, Blender had already UV unwrapped and straightened the UV for us. This is such a great feature. So, all I did was select the entire UV island and increased its scale along the x-axis to ensure the checker pattern remained square-shaped. As you can see, the checker grid perfectly follows the curve and displays beautifully. After unwrapping all the objects, it was time for an important step: equalizing the Texel density across all UV islands. You might remember this from episode 5 of this season. To do this, I first selected all the objects, switched to edit mode using Tab, and pressed A to select all the UV islands. Then from the UV menu, I chose Average Islands Scale. Okay, now the Texel density of all objects is uniform. Next, in the final step, I packed the UV islands. With all the islands still selected, I went to the UV menu, chose Pack Islands, disabled the Rotate option, and clicked Pack. Blender uniformly scaled all the islands without messing up their Texel density and neatly arranged them within the UV grid. And that's it. The UV unwrapping process for this object is finally complete. Now, we're ready to start creating materials together. Guys, make sure you try unwrapping this object yourself. If you run into any issues or have questions, I'm here to help you solve any problems. Alright, let's move on to creating materials using that cool new technique I promised at the beginning of this video. First, I'll select this object and switch this section to the shader editor. Now, by clicking on this icon, I'll remove the temporary UV grid material we created earlier. Then I'll click New to create a fresh material and name it Wood_Nightstand. Now, instead of dragging each texture into the shader editor one by one, and connecting everything manually, here is a faster way. First, select the principled BSDF node, then press Ctrl-Shift-T. A browser window will open. Just navigate to the folder where your textures are stored, and if you want, you can also click this icon to preview thumbnails of the images. Now select the textures you need. I'll choose these four: color, displacement, normal GL, and roughness, and click Principled Texture Setup. Look at this. Check out what Blender just did for us. As you can see, it automatically imported all the maps and connected each texture to its corresponding input. It even created frames for the textures and mapping nodes, organizing everything beautifully. This is a fantastic and powerful feature of the Node Wrangler add-on, which I explained how to enable back in episode 4 of this season. Check this out. It even set the correct color space for the roughness, normal, and displacement map to non-color. It's amazing. Okay, as you can see, the material is applied to the object, but we need to tweak some settings to get the desired result. For example, I'll select the displacement map and press M to temporarily mute it. As you can see, the result looks much better now. Next, I'll adjust the strength of the normal map node. To make the adjustment smoother, I'll hold Shift and drag to fine-tune the strength. Now you can see how much better it looks. So we don't actually need the displacement anymore, right? We can achieve our goal with just the normal map. So I'll delete the displacement node by selecting it and pressing X. I'll also remove the corresponding image texture node for the displacement texture and tidy up the node setup a bit. Okay, now I'll move these two nodes over here, press Shift A, and add a color ramp node. I'll place it on this connection so we can use it to adjust the color. Alright, before we change the texture color, it's a good idea to adjust the scene lighting first. This way, we can see the colors more accurately based on the lighting we want. For example, I'll use this HDRI image. Okay? Now let's adjust the texture color. I'll select this one and choose this color. Then I'll select this one and choose this color for it. To make the colors stand out more, I'll bring the two handles closer together, increasing the contrast between them. Okay? Next, I'll pan over in the shader editor, press Shift A, and add a value node. I'll place it inside this frame and connect it to the scale input. This way, I can easily adjust the texture scale using just one property. For example, by increasing the value, I'll make the texture scale smaller and fine-tune it until I'm happy with the result. We can also rotate the HDRI from this section to change the lighting angle and see the texture more clearly. For now, this scale works fine, but we can always adjust it later if needed. Okay, moving on, I'll go to the modifier properties and increase the bevel amount slightly to give this part of the object a more stylized look. Okay, rotate the camera around and check from different angles to ensure there are no issues. Alright, looks good. Now let's assign this material to the other parts of the object and see how it looks. I'll select these sections while holding Shift and make sure the last selection is the object with the wood material. Then I'll press Ctrl L and choose Link Materials. Perfect. Alright, I'll rotate the HDRI lighting again to cast a better light on the objects and help them show off their details. Alright, as you can see, the result is becoming very appealing. Something I noticed here is that the wood grain direction on the drawer is vertical, but it would look better horizontally, right? No problem, but remember to rotate the UVs for this section at the end to fix the wood grain direction. Alright, finally, to make the shadows look better, I'll head to the render properties and enable ray tracing. As you can see, the result improves drastically. Okay, next, I'll select this object and increase its bevel amount. As you can see, it looks much more cartoonish and appealing now. Let's do the same for the legs of the nightstand. I'll open the bevel modifier and increase the bevel amount here as well. Great! It now looks much more attractive and stylized compared to before. Okay, remember whenever you make changes to an object, try rotating the HDRI to see how the new details react under different angles of light. This will help ensure you're happy with the results. Okay? Perfect. Let's move on. Now, let's work on this object. After selecting it, I'll press numpad period to zoom in. In the shader editor, I'll delete the UV grid material by clicking on this icon and create a new material and naming it plastic_white. I'll adjust the viewport angle slightly and then reduce the roughness value. I think this amount is good for now. I'll tweak the roughness just a tiny bit more. Okay, for now we won't dive too deep into plastic material details. There are many ways to enhance plastic materials further, but that's not the focus of this episode, so we'll leave it at this for now. Next, let's move on to the parts that need a metal material. I'll select this object, remove its previous material, and create a new one, and naming it metal. Here, I'll select the Principled BSDF node, press Ctrl-Shift-T, and choose the following maps: color, normal GL, roughness, and metalness. After clicking Principled Texture Setup, all the connections are automatically set up, and this is how the material currently appears on the object. Next, let's go through the settings step by step. First, I'll hold down Ctrl-Shift and click on the color map to preview it directly. As you can see, it's not pure white. It's made up of white and gray tones. Since we want this part to look golden, we'll need to change the color first. So, to do this, I'll press Shift-A and add a color ramp node and placing it on this connection. Let me tidy up the nodes a bit so it's easier to follow. Okay, now let's adjust the color. I'll select the left handle and pick this golden color. Then I'll select the right handle and choose this color. Now, I'll bring the handles closer together to increase the contrast between the two colors. Okay, I'll hold down Ctrl-Shift again and click on the Principled BSDF so we can see the result. And as you can see, the golden color looks much more vibrant now. In the next step, let's fine-tune the normal map to bring out more details in the material. I'll set the strength to about this value, and as you can see, it adds some great details. Now, let's adjust the texture scale. So, I'll press Shift-A and add a value node, place it here, and connect it to the scale input. By increasing the value, I'll make the texture smaller. Looks much better now. Additionally, by adjusting the location properties, I can shift the texture around to display different parts of it on the object. Perfect. Finally, let's tweak the strength of the normal map again. Okay. That looks good. Now let's talk about the roughness map. If I preview it using Ctrl-Shift and click, you'll see it's a simple grayscale image with various details. This map determines which parts of the material should be shinier and which parts should be rougher based on the darkness or lightness of the image. Darker areas means less roughness or shinier, while lighter areas mean more roughness. If any of this seems unfamiliar, make sure you've watched episode 4 of this season, where I explained how grayscale images like this work. If you haven't seen it yet, check it out. It'll help clarify things. Now let's assume we're happy with the effect of the roughness map, but we want a bit more control over it. Okay, I'll connect the Principled BSDF to the output, and here you can see the roughness map is directly connected to the roughness input, and the numeric property for adjusting roughness is no longer available. So, what should we do? It's actually pretty simple. We can control the roughness by adjusting the contrast of this map instead. To do this, we can use a color ramp node again. So, I'll press Shift-A and add a color ramp to the connection. By moving the black and white handles closer together, I simply increase the contrast of the map. As you can see, this allows us to easily control the effect of the map. If I preview the color ramp using Ctrl-Shift and click, you'll notice how it modifies the roughness map. That's it. Now, I'll reconnect the Principled BSDF to the output and fine-tune the roughness value once more. Great. Next, let's take a look at the metallic map, or metalness map. When I preview it using Ctrl-Shift and click, it appears completely white, right? This white color corresponds to a value of 1 for the metallic property. However, if I adjust the location of the texture on the object, you'll notice some black spots in the map. These black areas simulate scratches or wear on the metal, and in these sections, the metallic value is actually 0. This map is simply a grayscale image, and its color space should be set to non-color for proper functionality. Thankfully, Node Wrangler has already set it correctly for us. Alright, now let's apply this material to the remaining objects. I'll select these two, hold Shift, and finally select the last object that already has the material applied. Then, I'll press Ctrl-L and choose Link Materials. And here is the result. Okay, something that might catch our attention here is why the details don't seem to appear clearly on these objects. Or why do the details look blurry when we zoom in closely? The texture we're using is 2K. Is its resolution so low that it's causing this issue? Well, this is where texel density comes into play again. And this time, we need to dive a bit deeper into the topic. It's an issue many beginners face, and understanding it will significantly improve your material creation skills. It's one of those things that takes you a step closer to becoming a pro. That said, I don't want to get too technical or overly advanced. I'll try to explain it as simply as possible. Okay, let me switch from the shader editor to the UV editor. If I select these objects and enter edit mode using tab, you can see that the UV islands of these objects are only displaying a small portion of the 2K texture on the object. That's why when we look at this object from a distance, we don't notice the low quality of the texture on these objects. The same applies in the UV editor. From this distance, the texture looks sharp. But if I zoom in on the area where the UV islands of these objects are mapped and bring the 3D viewport camera closer to the object to match that zoom level, you see that the image appears blurry both in the UV editor and on the object itself. So when a UV island is this small, it's as if the texture has been zoomed in this much before being displayed on the object, which is why it looks low resolution. So in situations where the camera needs to display the object up close, we can improve the texture quality on the object by enlarging its UV island. This way, more pixels from the texture will be mapped onto the object. Alright, I'll move my mouse over to the UV editor, press A to select all the UV islands of the selected objects, then press S, type 2, and hit enter. By doing this, we're telling Blender to use twice as many pixels from the texture for these UV islands compared to before. Now, if I zoom out a bit in the UV editor to see the full UV island and keep the camera distance unchanged in the 3D viewport, you'll notice that the texture on the object appears more sharper. Now, if I repeat the same steps, press S, type 2, and hit enter, the UV islands will become 4 times larger than their original size, meaning they'll display 4 times as many texture pixels on the object. As you can see, the image on the object becomes gradually sharper. So this is the essence of texel density. By enlarging the UV island, we've effectively increased the texel density for this object, allowing it to display more texture pixels. Now, of course, since we made the UV island larger, the texture scale has changed on the object, but we can easily adjust that later in the shader editor whenever needed. Okay, remember what we learned earlier. Texel density should be consistent across all UV islands of different parts of our 3D model so that the texture resolution looks uniform throughout the object. Earlier, we used average UV islands to maintain consistent UV scaling, but now that we've made the UV islands of these objects 4 times larger, the texel density balance is lost. For example, if you look at the wood texture on this part of the object, you'll notice that it appears blurry compared to the texture of the object where we increase the texel density. So, to maintain consistent texel density, we now need to scale up the UV islands of the other objects by 4 times as well. This way, all the objects in the model will have the same texel density, right? Okay, let's do it. First, I'll select only this object, switch to edit mode by pressing tab, then zoom out in the UV editor so I can see the UV island. Now, I'll move my mouse over it, press L to select the UV island, and then press S, type 4, and hit enter. Now back in object mode, if I zoom in a little, you'll notice that the wood texture on the object is no longer blurry from this distance. It now looks consistent with the object next to it. That's great. You can see that the wood grain appears much sharper and the texture no longer looks blurry. It's much crisper than before, right? However, the changes we made have introduced a new issue, one you might have already noticed. Okay, before addressing this problem, let's first increase the texel density of the remaining objects by the same amount, and then we'll tackle the issue. So, I'll select the remaining objects, enter edit mode using tab, move my cursor to the UV editor, press A to ensure all UV islands are selected, then press S, type 4, and hit enter. Okay, now if I go back to object mode, you can see how much the image resolution has improved across all parts of the object, making everything look much sharper. Alright, since we adjusted the scale of the UV islands, if I select all these objects and enter edit mode, you'll notice that the UV islands in the UV editor are overlapping significantly. So we need to pack them again. First, I'll make sure all islands are selected, then click Pack Islands from the UV menu. In a pop-up window, I'll ensure the Rotate option is disabled and click Pack. Okay, as you can see, Blender adjusts the scale of all islands to fit them inside the UV grid. But we don't want that. Doing so reduces the texel density, which lowers the sharpness and quality of the texture on the object. So, I'll undo a few steps using Ctrl-Z to bring the UV islands back to the texel density we set earlier. Then I'll click Pack Islands again from the UV menu, but this time, I'll also disable the scale option. This ensures Blender doesn't adjust the scale of our UV islands during packing, keeping the texel density intact. Now, if I click Pack, you'll see that Blender packed the islands without changing their scale, though they no longer stay within the 0 to 1 UV grid. Okay, let me clarify what we mean by 0 to 1 in the UV grid. It refers to the main UV area in the UV editor, where the coordinates range from 0 to 1 on both the X and Y axis. So here's the issue that arises when we increase the texel density of the UV islands. And it's actually quite natural. Since we made the UV islands 4 times larger, they no longer fit within the standard 0 to 1 UV grid. This is expected because their size has increased significantly. So what's the solution? If these UV islands extend beyond the UV grid but everything looks fine in the viewport when you check the model, does it really matter? Well, here's the thing. If you're working alone or as a freelancer and plan to render the entire project directly in Blender, there's absolutely no issue. You'll get the exact same result in the render that you see in the viewport. In this case, you could technically call it a day right here. However, if you're working on a team and collaborating with others, and the model will be passed along to other artists, imagine what happens when they open the file and check the UVs.
Oh my God.
In more advanced pipelines, when it comes to tasks like baking textures, working on the model in texturing software like Substance or Mari, or using the model in game engines like Unreal Engine or Unity, these kinds of UV setups can cause a lot of issues. Covering all those potential problems is beyond the scope of this episode. So, that's why the industry standard, the one everyone agrees on, is that all UV islands must stay inside the 0 to 1 UV space, and they should never extend beyond that boundary. If none of the terms I mentioned, like texture baking, game engines, or a specific software sound familiar to you, don't worry, it just means you haven't needed them yet, so this won't cause you any trouble for now. That being said, it's still important to know how to handle this situation properly and start adopting good habits early on. So, let's take a step toward becoming more professional. There are several ways to solve this issue, each with its own pros and cons. In this part, I'll introduce you to the 3 most common methods. You don't need to follow along step by step for the first 2 methods, just sit back, relax, and watch. However, I strongly recommend practicing the 3rd method alongside the video to ensure you fully understand it. Alright, from this point on, this part requires extra attention. So if you feel like you need some time to process everything we've covered so far, I suggest pausing here and coming back to the rest of the video later, okay? If you're ready, let's dive into the solutions. Right now, we're using a 2K texture. And to make sure the texture displays properly on the object, we had to scale up the UV islands by 4 times, right? In the previous state, when the UV islands were 4 times smaller than they are now, they all fit easily within the UV grid. So, we need to find a way to avoid making the UV islands 4 times larger, because only in that case will the UV islands fit properly within the UV grid. So, in this case, we could use a texture that's 4 times larger than the current one, meaning an 8K texture. This way, there is no need to scale the UV islands, and they'll all fit perfectly within the UV grid. Smart, right? Unfortunately, it's not as simple as it sounds, because this method has a major drawback, and you might already be able to guess what it is. When you use a higher resolution textures, the file size increases dramatically. As you can see, the 2K texture is only 47 MB, but the 8K texture is 824 MB. This large file size means it will take up more space on your hard drive, consume more memory, and significantly increase render times. And remember, this is just the metal materials textures. Don't forget about the wood textures, which would also need to be upgraded to 8K. Plus, consider the textures for other assets in the scene. It could quickly become frightening to manage, right? Because of these downsides, many people find this first solution impractical. No worries though, let's move on to the second solution. Let me show you how this works. These objects use the metal material, right? I'll select them, and since this object's UV island doesn't take up much space, I'll include it in the selection as well. Then, I'll switch to Edit mode, go to the UV editor, press Home key to frame the UV grid, and zoom in a bit. Okay? As you can see, we previously scaled these UV islands up by 4 times, so their texel density is already appropriate. Now, I'll simply click Pack Islands from the UV menu, ensuring the scale and rotation options are disabled, and click Pack. As you can see, even though they were scaled up by 4 times, they still fit nicely within the UV grid without any issues. Okay? Now let's tackle the wooden parts. First, I'll select these objects, enter Edit mode, and zoom out a bit. As you can see, we also scaled up the UV islands of these wooden parts by 4 times earlier. However, even though we excluded the metal UV islands to free up space in the UV grid, the wooden UV islands are still too large to fit comfortably. But here's where we can optimize things a bit. The metal material uses 2K textures, right? Instead of upscaling all textures to 8K, we can use 8K textures only for the wooden parts. This way, we can scale the wooden UV islands back down to their default size, meaning we need to make them 4 times smaller. Well, that's very easy. I'll select all the wooden UV islands, and here's a cool tip about Blender. You can easily use math symbols in Blender, and it will do the calculations for you automatically. For example, since I want these UV islands to be 4 times smaller, after pressing S for scale, I can simply type /4 and hit enter, and Blender will shrink the size of these UV islands by dividing them by 4. Awesome! Now let's pack them again. And as you can see, they fit perfectly within the UV grid. Finally, we just need to replace the wooden materials textures with the 8K resolutions in the shader editor. Simply click this icon for each node and select the corresponding 8K textures based on the map type. Just remember, after replacing the textures, double-check that the color space is set correctly. For maps like roughness and normal, ensure it's set to non-color. As you can see, the wood texture now displays at a much higher resolution, right? With this second method, we've optimized things slightly. This time, only the wooden material needed the higher resolution textures, while the metal material stayed at 2K. However, this approach still relies on higher resolution textures, so it doesn't fully solve the file size and render time issues we discussed earlier. While it's better than the first solution, it's still far from ideal for many workflows. So, what's the next option? This method is super exciting, really cool, and of course more advanced. In fact, explaining it fully deserves a separate video on its own. UDIM workflow gives us the ability to break free from the single UV grid limitation and use multiple UV tiles instead. Let me show you how it works quickly. First, I'll make sure the objects with the wood material are selected, then switch to edit mode using Tab. In the UV editor, I'll bring my mouse here and scroll and open the overlays options specific to the UV editor. Just notice that you must be in edit mode to see these options. They won't appear in object mode, okay? Now, under the tiles section, we have 2 axes, X and Y, both currently set to 1, right? If I change the X value to 2, you'll see an additional UV grid added along the X axis. Similarly, if I change the Y value to 2, you'll see a second row of UV grids added above. However, we don't need the Y axis for now, so I'll set it back to 1. Great! Now we can utilize this extra space by distributing our UV islands across multiple UV grids. This way, we can further optimize our workflow and use lower resolution textures. For example, if I scale up the UV islands of these wooden objects by 4 times, the textile density will match the metal parts perfectly. However, their size is now too large to fit even one island within a single UV grid. So scaling them up 4 times isn't practical here. But if I press S and type /2 and hit enter, the UV islands will shrink to half their size, meaning they're now twice as large as their original size, which still allows all islands to fit within the UV grid and distributed properly. So at this scale, I can place each island in different UV grids, right? This means I can now use 4K textures for the wooden parts instead of upgrading to 8K. So that's much better. Okay, now let's position these islands into the UDIM tiles. I'll deselect everything with a click, ensure I'm in face select mode, and move my cursor over this UV island. Then I'll press L to select it. Next, I'll click Pack Islands from the UV menu, ensuring the scale and rotation options are disabled. When I click Pack, you'll see that Blender places the island in the second UDIM tile. Okay, let me undo that step with Ctrl Z. Now, when clicking Pack Islands again, notice the Pack to option. It was set to closest UDIM, which is why Blender placed the selected island in the nearest available tile. So, if we want to pack the selected island into the first UV grid, simply change this option to Active UDIM and click Pack again. And that's it. Okay, if I zoom in a bit, as you can see, this UV island is slightly overlapping the edge of the UV grid. This actually shouldn't happen. We need to ensure no part of the UV island extends outside the UV grid or sits between UDIM tile boundaries. So, I'll press S and slightly reduce its scale. Then, I'll move it around manually to ensure it fits perfectly within the UV grid. Just be careful not to shrink it too much. Using as much texture space as possible ensures higher resolution textures on the object. Alright, here you can choose which texture you want to preview in the UV editor from this section. For example, since we're working with a wood texture, I'll select it from this list. Alright, as you can see on the object, slightly reducing the scale of the UV island didn't have a significant impact on the texture quality. Alright, now let's move on to the next island. I'll switch back to edit mode, zoom out a bit, and click on an empty space to deselect everything. Now I select the smaller UV islands using L, then I'll press G and manually place them inside the first UV grid. Perfect. Now let's work on this island. Again, I click on an empty space to deselect everything. I'll select it with L, and just pay close attention. You must be in face select mode so that other UV components don't get selected, okay? For example, if I switch to vertex select mode or edge select mode and press G, you see that other related components move along with the island. But in face select mode, this doesn't happen. Okay, now that I have it selected, I move it into the second UV grid. I also scale it down a bit and adjust its position to fit properly, making sure it doesn't overlap with the neighboring UV grid. Okay, as you can see, we still need more space for the remaining UV islands. So I go back to the tiles section and change X to 3 to add another UDIM tile. Now, I select this island and move it and place it here. Then I'll select the next one and move it and place it here. I tweak their positions slightly to keep everything organized, again making sure that no UV islands extend beyond their grid. Okay, we still have 2 more UV islands left, and as you can see, it seems we need another UV grid. So once again, I go back to the tiles section and increase X to 4. Now I select this UV island, move it and place it inside this UV grid. At this point, it looks like we might need to add another UV tile for the last UV island, right? Well, you might think, no need, I can just rotate this island 90 degrees and fit it into the existing UV grid. But here's the problem. Rotating it changes the wood grain direction on the object. The wood grain will now run horizontally, which doesn't look right for the legs of the nightstand, right? So in this case, rotating the UV island isn't a good solution. But what we can do is add more seams and break this large UV island into smaller pieces. For instance, this UV island corresponds to the inner part of this object. Let me switch to object mode, select this object and enter local view using /. Then I'll switch back to edit mode again. Okay, so this large UV island corresponds to the inner parts of this object, right? But think about it. How likely is it that the camera will ever see the inside of this object? Not very likely, right? So we can safely add more seams here to split the UV island into smaller sections, making it easier to fit them into the UV grid. To do this, I'll hold Alt and click to select these edges, then hold Shift and Alt and click to add these edges to the selection. You can also see in the UV editor which parts of the islands correspond to the edges we selected for the object. Okay, I'll move my cursor to the 3D viewport, press U, and mark these edges as seams. Next, I'll head back to the UV editor, ensure face select mode is active, select these separated sections, and move them around using G. For now, I'll leave them here. Next, I'll exit edit mode by pressing Tab, exit local view using /, select the wooden objects again, and switch back to edit mode. Okay, now I can easily select these UV islands and position them neatly within their respective UV grids. That's it. I'll place these 2 here and move this one here. As you can see, using UDIM workflow made it easy to pack all UV islands into different UV grids. We can now confidently use 4K resolution textures for the wood material and stick with 2K for the metal material. But the key point here is that each of these UV grids still has a lot of empty spaces. Ideally, we want to make the most out of the available texture space because optimizing resource usage is key to achieving the best results. So there is still so much more to learn. What I've covered today is essentially an introduction to identifying problems and possible solutions so you can recognize similar issues in your personal projects and make the best decisions based on the type of project you're working on. Remember, cameras don't always show every object up close. Camera distance relative to the object plays a crucial role in determining texel density. Higher texel densities are usually reserved for what we call hero assets, which are the most important elements in a scene that are frequently shown up close by the camera. That's why the UDIM workflow is commonly used for hero assets. For projects like Andy's room, where we're working right now, there is no need to use UDIM for every single model, so don't worry about it. For now, focus on practicing the UDIM workflow so you fully understand it. This way, when we get to set dressing stage later, we'll be better equipped to tackle any challenges and make smart decisions about texel density for our assets. Okay, finally, before we forget, let's fix the wood grain direction on the drawer and wrap up this video. We can easily fix that by selecting the drawer object, entering edit mode, and rotating its UV island by 90 degrees to align the wood grain correctly. Lastly, select all the wooden objects again, go into edit mode, and check that none of the UV islands are overlapping with each other. And that's it for this episode, guys. I hope you've learned some valuable things in this episode. If understanding these concepts felt challenging at first, don't worry, just watch the video again. Doing so will help you pick up on details you might have missed the first time around. As we progress through future episodes, these processes will become second nature due to repetition. Also, don't forget to join our Discord group. It's completely free and it's a great place to ask questions and solve any issues you encounter along the way. I wish you all the best and I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, take care.